The Hook. By the summer of 1942, the world held its breath. The Eastern Front had become the defining theater of the Second World War. Following a catastrophic failure at the gates of Moscow, Adolf Hitler made a fateful gamble, Operation Case Blue. It was a drive for oil, for power, and for the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, Stalingrad. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a clash of ideologies between two titans, Hitler and Stalin. One sought Lebensraum, the other survival at any cost. As the German Sixth Army approached the Volga, the city was transformed into a shattered labyrinth of rubble, a tomb for millions. In this documentary, we explored the brutal reality of urban combat, where soldiers fought floor by floor and snipers haunted every shadow. From the desperate German airlift that failed to feed a starving army to the ruthless ethics of a battlefield where even children were caught in the crossfire. This is the story of the invasion that doomed the Third Reich. Witness the rise, the ruin, and the ultimate fall of an empire in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. This is the prelude to the greatest turning point in human history. Stay with us for this deep dive into Operation Barbarossa and the road to the Volga. By the summer of 1942, the Eastern Front had already become the defining theater of the Second World War. The German Wehrmacht, following the catastrophic failure to seize Moscow in the winter of 1941, had regrouped for a renewed offensive in the southern sector of the Soviet Union. This operation, codenamed Case Blue, Fall Blau, was intended to secure the rich oil fields of the Caucasus and sever the Soviet Union's logistical lifeline along the Don and Volga rivers. Adolf Hitler, driven by his ideological obsession with crushing Bolshevism and securing Lebensraum, viewed the capture of Stalingrad as a symbolic and strategic imperative. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, and Hitler believed that its fall would strike a demoralizing psychological blow to Soviet morale. Moreover, controlling Stalingrad would safeguard the flank of the German advance into the Caucasus, ensuring the Wehrmacht could continue its southward drive without the constant threat of Soviet counterattacks from the industrialized Volga corridor. The initial phase of Case Blue began in June 1942. German forces, organized under Army Group South, advanced rapidly, exploiting the mobility and firepower of their panzer divisions. Their progress was initially unimpeded, as Soviet defenses had been weakened and overstretched. Cities like Rostov and Voronezh fell quickly under the German assault. However, the deeper the Wehrmacht pushed into Soviet territory, the more it encountered the logistical nightmare of maintaining supply lines over vast distances through terrain scarred by scorched earth tactics and against an increasingly determined Soviet resistance. By late August, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Paulus, began its approach toward Stalingrad, while elements of the Fourth Panzer Army pushed south toward the Caucasus oil fields. Hitler's obsession with the city, combined with Stalin's order to defend it at all costs, transformed the approaching battle into a clash not merely over geography, but over ideology, prestige, and the symbolic heart of the Soviet war effort. Stalingrad itself, located on the western bank of the Volga River, was a sprawling industrial hub. Factories producing armaments, tanks, and tractors were interspersed with densely packed residential districts. By the time the German armies arrived, the city had already been partially evacuated, yet tens of thousands of civilians remained, many of them conscripted into defensive efforts, including constructing fortifications, moving supplies, and assisting in logistical operations. Soviet authorities mobilized every available resource, recognizing that control of the city meant maintaining a critical link in the eastern supply chain and a foothold in the industrialized heart of southern Russia. The German assault began in earnest in late August 1942. Initial bombing raids by the Luftwaffe devastated large swaths of the city, reducing residential and industrial districts alike to rubble. The psychological impact of these bombings on both civilians and defenders was immense, yet rather than breaking Soviet resolve, it hardened it. Soviet troops, supported by hastily assembled militias and workers, prepared for a defensive struggle in which every street, factory, and apartment block could serve as a defensive position. The nature of urban combat, fighting building by building, floor by floor, would soon reveal itself to be a brutal test of endurance, resourcefulness, and sheer human will. As the German Sixth Army crossed the Don and moved toward the city, logistical challenges began to mount. Supplies of food, ammunition, and water were limited, and the increasing density of combat zones meant that vehicles, artillery, and infantry units were frequently bottlenecked in narrow streets. Meanwhile, Soviet forces had begun a systematic strategy of defense in industrial complexes, grain silos, and residential blocks, turning them into fortified positions. Snipers concealed in rubble and high vantage points inflicted significant casualties, forcing German troops to advance with extreme caution. By mid-September, the battle for Stalingrad had entered its most intensive phase. The city, though partially destroyed by aerial bombardment, remained fiercely defended. The German High Command had underestimated the Soviet commitment to the city and overestimated their own capacity for rapid urban conquest. German units, trained primarily for mobile warfare and rapid encirclement, found themselves mired in a grueling attritional fight for street-level control. Casualties began to mount, and the reality of prolonged combat in a city that had been transformed into a labyrinth of rebel and fortified positions became increasingly apparent. At the same time, Soviet forces employed a systematic strategy of elastic defense, trading space for time, conducting counterattacks, and exploiting German overextension. Reinforcements flowed into Stalingrad, even as the Sixth Army pressed deeper into the urban landscape. The combination of tenacious Soviet resistance, logistical strain, and the harsh winter conditions that were beginning to set in would soon render the German advance perilous, foreshadowing the calamity that awaited the Wehrmacht in the months to come. By late September, the Germans had secured portions of the city, but at a staggering cost. The Wehrmacht's advance had stalled in several sectors, leaving pockets of intense resistance. Street-by-street combat created a situation in which German commanders could not easily maneuver reserves or artillery, and each building became a mini battlefield. The battle had already begun to consume vast quantities of men, equipment, and morale. The city's industrial complexes, though partially destroyed, remained points of resistance, with Soviet defenders using subterranean networks, factory floors, and even sewer systems to conduct ambushes and harassing operations against German troops. The stage was now set for a protracted siege of unparalleled intensity. What had begun as a rapid maneuver had degenerated into a grinding urban conflict characterized by exhaustion, scarcity, and escalating casualties. Both sides would be forced to confront the limits of endurance, the cruelty of winter, and the unrelenting determination of their opponent. The battle for Stalingrad was no longer merely a fight for a city, it had become a struggle for survival. A crucible in which the fates of entire armies and the broader trajectory of the war in the East would be determined. The water and supply crisis. Among the most severe challenges for the German soldiers was the scarcity of essential resources, particularly water. Stalingrad's infrastructure had been decimated by bombardment, leaving few functioning wells or water supplies. Soldiers had to venture into exposed areas, often under sniper fire, to collect what little water remained. Many succumbed to dehydration, collapsing into the icy waters of the Volga or freezing to death on the banks. Desperation led to morally reprehensible practices as German forces attempted to utilize local civilians, including children, to collect water for them. Orphans were coerced with promises of chocolate or other rewards, yet the Germans could provide nothing. Tragically, Soviet command responded with ruthless countermeasures, ordering snipers to eliminate children used in this manner, branding them as collaborators. These actions highlighted the horrifying ethical degradation and human cost inherent in urban warfare, where survival instincts often collided with moral boundaries. Food and ammunition were equally scarce. German troops, encircled and isolated, began suffering from starvation, frostbite, and rampant disease. Malnutrition weakened soldiers physically and mentally, eroding discipline within units. Instances of insubordination,
brawls, and even fratricide became increasingly common as men grappled with the hopelessness of their situation. The once tightly regimented Wehrmacht began to fracture under the relentless pressures of combat and deprivation. The German airlift. Recognizing the impossibility of overland resupply, the German High Command attempted to maintain their forces through a massive airlift operation. Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, along with converted Heinkel bombers, were pressed into service to deliver supplies directly into the shrinking pockets of resistance within the city. In theory, the Luftwaffe could deliver up to 500 tons of food, ammunition, and medical supplies per day, but in reality, the operation was disastrous. By the winter of 1942, harsh conditions severely hampered air operations. Thick fog, heavy snowfall, and icy runways rendered takeoffs and landings hazardous. Artillery bombardments had cratered makeshift airstrips, and in the whiteout conditions, many aircraft lost landing gear or were destroyed upon touchdown. Even when supplies reached the city, they were insufficient for the beleaguered troops. The airlift, already stretched thin by attrition and weather, averaged only about 114 tons per day, far below the minimum needed to sustain the Sixth Army. Each flight exacted a heavy toll on pilots and crew, with hundreds of aircraft lost to accidents, enemy fire, or the brutal winter. Despite these challenges, the Luftwaffe made heroic but ultimately futile efforts to sustain the trapped forces. Gunners reported throwing miscellaneous items at attacking Soviet fighters in sheer desperation, including rolls of toilet paper, illustrating the extreme conditions and improvisation required. By mid-January 1943, the German airlift had collapsed almost entirely, leaving Paulus's army isolated and starving. Encirclement and the Soviet counteroffensive. Meanwhile, the Soviets prepared their counterstroke. Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, targeted the weaker Romanian and Italian flanks, protecting the German Sixth Army. Swift and overwhelming, Soviet forces encircled the Germans, trapping 265,000 Axis soldiers with the Soviet offensive and encirclement. The Soviets were unrelenting. By January 26, 1943, a major Soviet assault split the German pocket in two, severing communication and making coordinated resistance impossible. The once cohesive German front had dissolved into isolated groups, trapped amidst ruins with no hope of relief. The Luftwaffe's last flights could barely deliver enough food for a few hundred men, and with the airfields increasingly unusable, the supply situation was hopeless. Soviet forces, well supplied and reinforced, systematically reduced the German positions. They advanced through the frozen streets, utilizing artillery, machine guns, and snipers to deadly effect. The urban landscape, once a potential advantage for defenders, now served as a tomb for those too weak to retreat or resist. Paulus's promotion and the pressure to die. In the midst of this collapse, Hitler made a symbolic but cruel gesture. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943. In Hitler's eyes, no German field marshal had ever been captured alive, and the promotion carried a thinly veiled expectation of suicide. Hitler intended to maintain the illusion of German invincibility, even as reality crumbled around him. Paulus, however, refused to comply. He reportedly told his staff, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." The promotion did little to restore morale or change the tactical situation. If anything, it underscored the disconnection between the German High Command and the stark reality facing the troops. The last stand. By late January, the German positions had become indefensible. Supplies were exhausted, ammunition was scarce, and men were physically incapable of sustained combat. Starvation and frostbite claimed hundreds daily. Field hospitals had collapsed, and the few doctors available were overwhelmed. Every street, building and factory was now a frozen tomb or a battlefield. Despite this, pockets of resistance remained. Some units attempted desperate breakouts, while others fought fiercely to delay the inevitable. Yet by January 31st, 1943, Paulus himself was captured. He surrendered his staff but allowed his men to choose their fates, leaving fragmented groups to decide individually whether to continue fighting or surrender. The final German positions finally fell on February 2, 1943, marking the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. Of the original 265,000 Axis troops, only 91,000 survived to be taken into Soviet captivity. Many of these prisoners would die in Soviet labor camps. Only around 6,000 would return home after the war. Thousands more continued to hide in the ruins for months, but for these men there was no future. Human cost. The human toll was staggering. Nearly 2 million casualties occurred during the battle, including soldiers and civilians, making Stalingrad one of the deadliest engagements in history. The urban combat, combined with starvation, frostbite, and disease, produced horrors unimaginable to those outside the city. For Germany, it was a symbolic and strategic catastrophe, the beginning of the end for Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich. Stalingrad became more than a battle for territory. It represented the brutal nature of total war, where ideology, survival, and human suffering collided. Both the Soviets and Germans experienced the extremes of human endurance and moral compromise. For the Soviets, victory at Stalingrad demonstrated the resilience and capacity of the Red Army, opening the path to liberate Eastern Europe. For Germany, it marked a turning point. From this defeat, the Wehrmacht would never fully recover its initiative in the East. Strategic implications. The fall of Stalingrad shifted the momentum on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, emboldened by their victory, began a series of offensives that would ultimately push the Germans back to Berlin. The psychological impact was immense. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, while Stalin's reputation soared as the leader who had orchestrated the defense and eventual counterattack. For Hitler, the defeat exposed the flaws in his military strategy and his insistence on absolute obedience. Commanders learned that ideological loyalty could not compensate for logistical impossibility, poor planning, and environmental extremes. The Battle of Stalingrad would serve as a lesson in the limits of human endurance, the dangers of hubris, and the inexorable toll of total war. The surrender of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, marked not just the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, but also a turning point in World War II. The city, reduced to ruins, bore witness to the full scale of modern warfare's brutality, the interplay of ideology, and the human cost of total war. Fate of the survivors. Of the 91,000 German and Axis soldiers who survived to be captured, the majority faced grim prospects. Starvation, disease, and forced labor in the Soviet Union claimed tens of thousands of lives. Only around 6,000 would return home after the war. Many died in transit. Others perished in labor camps or succumbed to the harsh Russian winters. These survivors bore physical scars, but the psychological trauma of Stalingrad, witnessing friends freeze, starve, or be shot, would last a lifetime. For the civilians of Stalingrad, the battle was cataclysmic. Thousands had perished in bombings, artillery fire, or during desperate attempts to flee. The city itself was virtually annihilated. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and essential infrastructure, water and electricity, had vanished. Those who survived faced months of reconstruction under Soviet supervision, living amidst ruins and the constant reminders of the conflict. Strategic implications. The fall of Stalingrad shattered German strategic dominance on the Eastern Front. Hitler's previously unstoppable Wehrmacht was now weakened beyond repair, with enormous losses in manpower, equipment, and morale. For the first time, the Red Army had decisively turned the tide, demonstrating that the German army could be beaten in large-scale conventional warfare. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Germans, the defeat undermined the myth of invincibility and exposed the dangers of blind obedience to ideology over practical strategy. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, determination, and the effective mobilization of both military and civilian resources in defense of the homeland. Hitler and the German High Command. The defeat at Stalingrad forced a reckoning within the German High Command. Hitler's insistence on no surrender had turned a tactical stalemate into a strategic catastrophe. The loss also strained German alliances in Europe, undermining Axis morale and demonstrating the limits of Nazi expansionism. Following Stalingrad, German operations in the East became predominantly defensive, marking a fundamental shift in the course of the war. Paulus himself survived captivity and was held by the Soviets until 1953. During his imprisonment, he was extensively interrogated and even participated in propaganda efforts encouraging other German soldiers to surrender. His post-war life in West Germany was quiet, but overshadowed by his role at Stalingrad, a living reminder of the cost of the Führer's obstinacy. Civilian and cultural impact. Stalingrad's civilian population bore the brunt of the city's devastation. Soviet propaganda emphasized the heroic defense of the city, portraying ordinary citizens alongside soldiers as essential participants in victory. Stories of factory workers, snipers, and even children contributed to the narrative of a united Soviet front. Yet, the reality was far more harrowing. Families were torn apart, children were orphaned, and survivors faced years of deprivation. Culturally, Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Monuments, memorials, and literature commemorated the sacrifice and endurance of its defenders. The phrase Stalingrad would echo as a shorthand for determination against overwhelming odds, influencing both Soviet identity and global perceptions of the war. The broader Eastern Front. The victory at Stalingrad had immediate strategic consequences. It halted the German advance into the Soviet Union, secured the southern flank, and provided momentum for subsequent Soviet offensives. Within 2 years, the Red Army was advancing into Eastern Europe, ultimately reaching Berlin and forcing Germany into unconditional surrender by May 1945. Stalingrad also marked a shift in military tactics. Urban combat, winter warfare, and the integration of snipers, artillery, and civilian defense forces highlighted the evolving nature of total war. Lessons learned in Stalingrad informed both German defensive strategies in the West and Soviet offensives across Eastern Europe. Legacy of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad left a permanent imprint on history. Human cost, nearly 2 million casualties, including soldiers and civilians, made it one of the deadliest battles in recorded history. Strategic turning point. It marked the beginning of Germany's retreat on the Eastern Front. Symbolic significance. Stalingrad became an emblem of resilience, sacrifice, and the horrors of modern warfare. For both Germany and the Soviet Union, the battle represented more than a military engagement. It encapsulated the extremes of human endurance, the consequences of strategic miscalculation, and the impact of ideology on wartime decision-making. It showed that even the most formidable military machine could be destroyed when overextended, outmaneuvered, and deprived of logistical support. Stalingrad in memory. In post-war Europe, Stalingrad was remembered differently by both sides. In the Soviet Union, it was celebrated as a defining victory, a testament to Stalin's leadership and the Red Army's effectiveness. In Germany, it was remembered as a tragic lesson in hubris and the cost of blind obedience, a point of reflection for both military and civilian society alike. The ruins of Stalingrad were gradually rebuilt, but the memory of the battle remained vivid. The stories of survival, sacrifice, and horror became part of global consciousness, ensuring that Stalingrad would never be forgotten as just another military engagement. It was a monument to both human resilience and human suffering.